Yes, Lulu, can you hear me now? So I can continue? Okay, perfect. We would like to thank you all for joining us for the 5th Annual Investment Meeting webinar series. My name is Prashant Udrani, conference producer for AIM, and I'll be your MC for today. We have an interesting lineup of speakers to look forward to. We will begin with a presentation by Andrea and Anthony on the topic fundraising in the time of global dislocation, which will last for an hour. After that, we'll follow it up with a 15 minutes panel discussion titled Fundraising and Investing During Economic Disruption, moderated by Robin Brazil. Joining her will be an expert panel of VCs. I would like to share a brief intro about AIM. It is the largest investment platform in the world, an initiative of the UAE Ministry of Economy. AIM has been promoting a healthier global economy by linking investment opportunities to fast-growing economies under 6 key pillars: foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, small and medium enterprise, startups, and future cities, with a special event, One Belt, One Road. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you experience any issue with your audio or video during the webinar, just refresh your browser and that should take care of everything. We would also suggest using Chrome, Firefox, or Opera. If you have any questions during the presentation or to any of the panel of experts, please type them into the question box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If the question is addressed to a particular speaker, please do mention their name at the start of the question. During the webinar, we'll be running live polls located beside the question tab. We would request you to participate by casting your votes. I would now like to introduce our first 2 speakers, Andrea and Anthony from ANTLER, to cover what companies would expect when fundraising at this time of global dislocation. Andrea, Anthony, I would like to invite you up on stage to follow up with the presentation.
Hi. Hey, everyone.
Yes, we can hear you clearly, Anne.
Awesome.
Hi, just checking my sound's okay as well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great.
Excellent. Amazing. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming to listen to us. Ant and I have prepared a presentation to talk you through the most common issues that currently I think are on top of mind of all founders who we are encountering. And to be able to tailor it a little bit better as we're chatting to you, we thought we would run a very, very quick poll, our first poll on actually who do we have on the call today. So if you go to the poll button, it would be great if you could just quickly submit your answers. Wonderful. Looks like we're balancing that very, very nicely. It's nice to see we have a good proportion of the people in the audience are founders. Wonderful, excellent. I think it's still going up. Great. I think we're probably almost there. Thank you so much, everybody. It looks like almost half of the audience are actually founders. So hopefully those of you who are founders have either been through this or are going through this, you'll find today's presentation very useful. And back to you.
Excellent, guys. Thanks very much for joining us today. It's probably worth saying it's great that technology is so fantastic these days, because we've got Andrea in Singapore, I'm in Sydney, Australia, and I imagine a lot of you guys are in the in Middle East and all over the world. So great to be here with you today.
We can't see you, Ant.
Oh, you can't see me?
No.
Oh. Okay. I'm not quite sure why that I'm not quite sure why that is, but I should appear. Lulu says she can see me, so I think
Okay, could be mine.
hopefully I'm here. If not, you guys can hear me. Excellent, you guys can see me. So in terms of fundraising and what to expect on the journey, I think at the in normal times, the advice that we give to our teams is probably similar, if not there are some additions for COVID-19 times. But I think the first thing that we like to tell our teams at ANTLER and those raising money is that you really need to prepare for fundraising like it's a bit of a marathon and a bit of a process. And a lot of the time, companies will tell you about how to prepare pitch decks and how to talk to investors, but much less about how to run a successful fundraising process. And this is really what we want to talk to you guys about today. It's a process that typically can take anywhere between kind of two and 3 and 4 months if you run the process really well. And one of the hard things about running a fundraising process and the journey is that you have to be prepared for a lot of rejection. And you need to accept that it is just part of the process and really not take it to heart, but really look at the feedback that the VCs give you. It's important that you really don't get demoralized by the process, and you keep your kind of eye on the prize and your eye on the goal as to where you want to go and learn during that process as well.
Thanks, Ant. I guess just to give you a little bit of a background on why Ant and I are here today and are able to talk to you about this. It's a very quick background on who we are and what we do. ANTLER is an early stage venture capital fund, which is just over 3 years old and is now global. We are at 11 offices across 6 continents. You can see where we are in the globe. And we've given this advice that we're talking to you about systematically over 1,500 founders across this time. I guess you all know that whatever statistics you're reading, 95% of startups fail. And of course, everyone knows also that the top 3 reasons why these startups fail most of the time is, number 1 is there's no product market fit. Number 2 is the wrong people are working on the idea. And number 3 is money. So we started with the idea just over 3 years ago. What if there was a place globally where one could go to turn to become a founder, which helps you systematically to reduce the risk of failure? And so the idea of ANTLER was born, and you can see that what we do at ANTLER spans from actually growing companies from the very beginning by inviting and recruiting founders into the ANTLER ecosystem, and helping them find their perfect co-founders, helping them come up with a great idea, and then deciding whether or not we are actually going to fund those ideas. So we start at the very, very early stage at pre-seed, and then those founders who are successful at being able to secure capital with ANTLER at pre-seed, we then support them systematically through the scaling and the growth process process all the way through to Series C. So what you're about to hear is really the advice that we live and breathe on a daily basis. And so we are super happy to share this with you today. And, you know, both Ant and I are those people who thrive on a bit of conversation, so we are super happy to receive your questions all through this presentation. Don't wait until the end. I'll try and look out for questions for Ant, and he will do the same thing for me. So if you've got a question, please feel free to write it down, and we will get to it as soon as we pick them up. Ant, back to you.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So one of the things that we talked to about the teams before fundraising is really trying to establish where they are on the fundraising journey. And you guys who are founding businesses or growing businesses or potentially investors may well be familiar with components of this. And we start with the pre-seed funding, which is really when you've got a well-developed pitch deck, but you may not have much else. You might have good kind of theoretical validation around the product you want to build, but you're in this kind of quite challenging chicken and egg situation where you need a little bit of money to get started to build something to prove that you've got something then continually worth funding. And this is an area actually where ANTLER helps greatly, because we are able to bring money to those earliest ideas and those most phenomenal founders and teams very, very early. You then have the seed funding stage, where generally you've got some indication that you potentially are onto something that could be interesting and worth funding a little bit more, and it helps you get that product to market, get early customers, and start to build a little bit of traction. Series A is typically where you've got some pretty high conviction about your product market fit. You've got some good ideas about some growth channels and being able to actually validate that the customers want your product. And you're then starting to bring some money in to expand the team out a little bit, further validate the product market fit, start spending a little bit of money behind those some of those channels to prove that there's depth behind those growth channels, and building your product and your features out. Then comes the Series B stage, which is really about growth capital, and that's really being able to put a lot of money and a lot of resource behind what you've learned in the period up to there. So you know the channels that are successful for you, the growth channels that are probably successful for you. You've got deeper validation on your product, and you've started to get familiar with metrics around churn and understanding your customer behavior to quite some depth there. Rounds of growth capital, which are really about accelerating the trajectory that your company is on. It could help you steal market share by acquiring competitors or taking market share away from competitors, and really preparing your business towards an exit, which could be an IPO or of course a trade sale event. Most of the information that we're going to talk to do today will be really focused around the pre-seed and the seed and those earlier stages of funding. But a lot of it is actually quite relevant across all those other stages of funding as well, especially with regards to the process and the preparedness that you should really go into that with.
So one of the things that we wanted to establish really upfront is, what is this presentation about? What are we talking about when we're talking about companies? For us, the definition of a startup is a company that is built to grow fast. And of course, with that definition comes a very, very obvious conclusion, which is that it needs a lot of money to be able to grow fast. And of course, without external startup funding, the vast majority of startups die. You will have all been in this situation, or you know somebody in a situation where they bootstrap their own company and they've been unable to continually raise funds, and therefore, no matter how great the ideas were, or they thought they were great, they were unable to secure funding, and therefore the company failed. It's of course the amount of money that you need for your startup to take it to profitability is of course well beyond what normally people can afford, and therefore people start going for external financing. The high growth companies, obviously almost always need to burn a lot more capital to sustain their growth prior to achieving profitability. So what they do is obviously they go out to the market and they look for external funding. cash not only allows startups to live and grow, but it's also super important to give you a competitive advantage, hiring the best staff, being able to run a really high impact public relations, marketing and sales. So most startups end up raising external money. Of course, there's the good news that private markets in the last 10 years have come a long way, and there's lots of investors hoping to give to the right startup money, and we will talk about who these investors are, what category they are, and what matters to them. And of course, the aspirations are always to hit one or two, a handful of winners. As Anthony mentioned earlier, of course, there is bad news. Fundraising, and I've been doing this for a living for almost 20 years, is absolutely brutal. So the actual process of raising money is long, it's complex, and sometimes it really does hurt your ego. But nevertheless, it's part of being a founder. It's part of going through that process. And I would say that one of the key differentiators of people who are able to fundraise successfully compared to those who can't, or all things being equal, is how well they have planned. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, we will have given you at least a handful of tips of how to organize yourself better, what should be your strategy, what materials you will need. And so, over to you. Oh no, sorry, this is still mine. I'm just talking about, okay, what have we seen over the last 2 months? Let's say that COVID really has begun to impact us. Ant has mentioned that I'm sitting in Singapore. We've been living with COVID since January, but really in earnest for the last 2 months. What have we seen? Of course, as we entered 2020, there was a lot of dry powder within the venture community, and there was really high hopes for startups to be able to secure capital, especially the early stages where you're looking for smaller amounts of money. There was a lot of venture capital that has not been deployed prior to 2020. So this is obviously still good news. However, I think things have definitely changed. I think one of the key things that we're looking at right now is how is the venture capital industry going to decide how to deploy money? What attention will they give to their current existing portfolio versus versus investing into new opportunities? This, of course, nobody really truly knows. There's definitely a focus on making sure that your current investments are well looked after. Thankfully, there are some governmental support in most jurisdictions. Nevertheless, if you look at this NFX quick poll that was run about 4 weeks ago, the majority of US VCs that were polled felt that it will take 12 to 18 months to see a full recovery in the US. Having said all of this, the VCs are still looking at early stage, and of course, the earlier you are, the more likelihood is that you've got a longer journey ahead of you, and what we definitely have seen is that VCs that are in the market are, slower to make a decision and to execute. Nevertheless, for us, we are a great believer on the fact that the best companies, they will always get funded. And in fact, there's been many examples of companies that were created during, recession or any other dislocation. And so we remain very positive. We remain obviously cautiously positive. We must acknowledge that things have changed since the beginning of the year, but we advise our companies who we invested in at pre-seed, who are now out in the market raising seed, follow-on investments. We advise them to keep on going, to reduce burn rate as much as possible, just to make sure that they've got a longer runway. As a sort of general overview of the current situation, just to reiterate, we believe that there is still obviously money in the market, but we expect that VCs will be slower to make decisions and slower to execute. We have our second poll. And this is very interesting. I received this data only 4 days ago. This comes from First Republic's bank's quick poll to their customers. That's over 450 venture capitalists across the United States. So what percentage of VCs would make a major decision based on a Zoom call? So they defined major decision as a core investment. Please submit your votes. So far, we've got a very even distribution between 14, 47, and 31. We still have answers coming in. I can see it. Well, I'm happy to let you know that you are more pessimistic than reality. 68% of the respondents of this quick poll by First Republic Bank actually said that they would make a major decision based on a Zoom call or a series of Zoom calls. So that tells you that things are changing super fast. And there is, this is a little positivity in the market, and people are getting used to the new reality. Back to you, Ant.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think before we go on to this, a really interesting question has come through, which from Naga, saying everybody has been suggesting that you should raise funds, but most funds are dried up, and whoever is coming forward there with stringent rules. And I think the question is, are there funds? Really, the underlying question there is, are there funds out there at this moment in time? And I can definitely talk to that from a perspective of what we understand to be going on here in Australia, and what the news that we're hearing coming out of the US and out of Europe as well, is that actually the VCs are probably sitting on more cash than they've ever had before. Back in 2018 and 2019 were really record years for raising VC funds, and bigger funds were raised. So there's significant amount of capital out there to be deployed on a global basis. The learnings of the last time we had kind of wider market dislocation during the GFC back in 2008, were that actually, again, a lot of the funds were fairly cashed up at that time, but a greater proportion of the capital that was sitting there waiting to be deployed went into existing portfolios. And so the kind of wider concern within the market now is, should companies be raising now, or wait to get through this kind of more challenging period? And our view is that there's a lot of cash out there to be invested right now. We don't know how many venture funds are ultimately going to have to deploy a greater proportion of their cash to the existing portfolio, in which case their funds may not last them as long as they had intended. So funds that expected to deploy in 4 years may deploy in 3. Those that thought they may deploy in 3 years may deploy in 2. And at some point there may be a more challenging time to raise, just because of the timing of when VC funds are out there raising money and able to deploy. So our view is that companies that do need to fundraise should absolutely be out there talking to investors right now. And we'll come on to it a little bit later, but we're actually even telling some of our companies to potentially start their fundraisings even earlier and raise a little bit more money to help them get through what could be a bit more of a challenging fundraising period in 2021. There are a couple of questions as well from Marvin in terms of and Ayush in terms of industries that we think are interesting, and we've got a little bit to cover on that later in the presentation, so we'll hold those questions until then. So back seed money, And this is quite interesting. It's kind of a mix of an art and a science, but you're ultimately going to be successful at raising money when you have you give the early stage investors who are generally used to taking a lot of risk. They realize that investing at businesses at this stage isn't a certain bet, and normally a lot of them will invest in a number of startups to make sure that they're diversified, hoping that they've picked a few winners. And it's really about getting the investor to a point of comfort where there is enough evidence or inevitability that the chances of you being successful and this venture being successful is there for them to be able to essentially part with their cash and part with their investment. And so you have situations where you have founders who are incredibly who have had exits before, who find it pretty easy to raise a seed round based on their experience, their battle wounds, what they've learned along the way. Maybe they haven't had an exit before, but they've at least started a number of businesses before and learned along the way enough to engage and convince investors that this is worth placing an investment in. But for most founders, they're going to need to persuade the investors a little bit more. And usually that'll be about getting a product that is out there, getting some level of customer engagement, and showing that the customers ultimately love their product and that this is a team that can not just build a product, but actually get customers and continue to grow that customer base. And the more evidence that you have that you are capable of doing those things, the more likely it is that you will be able to attract investors to your business and to your startup. And of course, it's a fine line between how much evidence is too much to the point that you ultimately can't get there because you'd run out of money, and what is enough to convince investors. And then how much to raise. And this is a really interesting topic. We've seen companies that go out to not raising enough and companies that go out and raise far too much. And there are definitely consequences of both of those. Typically, at the early stage of funding, we would encourage all founders to set some pretty significant milestones. In fact, we'd tell them to look ahead to the next funding round and understand what kind of metrics and what kind of evidence and progress would a company need at that stage to raise a decent or what would be considered a good funding round, and then work backwards. And typically, that's historically been about normally about 12-month intervals. Although having said that, as a result of COVID, and we'll come on to that, we are suggesting that you extend that runway a little bit. And so how much to raise is really about, well, how much money do you need to get to your next fundable milestone? And that could be a certain number of customers, that could be a specific product launch or a certain number of features. It could be more of a regulatory issue. So getting, if you're working in the insurance sector, maybe getting some kind of license or permission to actually launch a product. Or in fintech, it could be about getting some kind of license or approval. And in choosing how much to raise, there's no real, magic formula for this. These things are quite often a little bit of a negotiation. But it's actually what we suggest to our companies is trying to make sure that you're raising enough money to be able to get you to your next milestone without going after a crazy high valuation that may mean that you actually impact the quality of the investors that you get in, but also you don't go for too low a valuation to the point that you might overly dilute. And that means really overly diluting is really about giving away too much equity in a round, such that the subsequent rounds you get to, the founders ultimately have very little of the equity in the company left and really lose motivation, which is a bad outcome for everyone. So what we tell our companies, as I mentioned, is as a rule of thumb, is trying to raise enough money that you can get to your next milestone. But the one thing that's often not communicated that is worthy of consideration is we said earlier that it can often take 2 to 4 months or even longer to raise your next round. And that really needs to be baked into your plans as terms of getting to your milestone and then having a buffer to be able to raise that round. So when you're doing your financial planning, you're looking at your cash runway, make sure you look at what it will take to get to that milestone, and also make sure you put in the buffer to be able to raise your round. Of course, you could start raising the round before you get to that milestone and start those conversations as you're on the way again in getting that traction. And then for COVID, what we've really done in terms of adjusting our advice, and in light of what I said earlier about the fact that we think that 2021 might be a very challenging year for raising funds, is said to our teams, rather than try and raise for 12 months runway, they should be really looking at raising closer to 18 months or even 24 months runway to get them through 2021 and avoid the situation of running out of cash and needing to raise there in what could be quite a challenging year. Of course, if you're absolutely smashing it out the park, Andrea mentioned earlier that the best businesses will always be able to raise in any kind of conditions. If you're smashing it out the park, then there's the opportunity to accelerate your plans, bring investment in earlier. But what we're really trying to do is make sure that businesses don't die because they run out of cash, and great businesses don't die. So we told our businesses, if anyone, is make two plans. Make what you plan that you would have for more normal times and how much money you would want for 18 months runway. And then a scaled back minimal plan where you can't do everything that you would want to do, but you're doing enough to continue to make progress, continue to progress the company forwards, and keep your customers and your investors and your stakeholders engaged, and see how much money that would take. And then you at least know when you go out to fundraising what your target would be, which is the original plan. But then you also have a kind of a lower backup target in case that fundraising doesn't go to plan, and you know what it would take to keep the business alive for that 18-month period to really get through what could be a more challenging time of this dislocation in the market. And then on to the valuation. So again, this is a little bit of an art and a little bit of a science. And you often see companies raising on different levels of valuations, and you can't really understand quite how they've done that. And at the earliest stages, it really does depend on a number of factors. One is the quality of the founding team, the size of the opportunity. If it's a huge size and you've got a great team, you're probably more capable of negotiating the valuation upwards. Looking at the traction that you've got, and ultimately you can have a bit of an idea as to what valuation you think you is most suitable for you. Also taking into account the information on the previous slide, which is how much to raise. I'm really targeting between a 10 and 20% dilution at those earlier rounds. But sometimes investors won't take it on, won't take what you think your valuation is as kind of gospel or the right valuation that they're comfortable with. And in which case, what you should really be doing is referring to comparable metrics that exist in the market to kind of really support your case for the valuation that you're choosing. And we've got here on the next slide, I will come back to that previous slide, some very interesting metrics that show how information that shows how fundraising in different stages can vary, and also different markets can really vary. And you can see here, Australia, the market that I'm in, the median amount of money raised at a pre-seed in Australia here is $71,000. And you go to New York and it's 200, or San Francisco and it's 250,000. Investors in those markets are much more comfortable giving out much bigger checks at this earlier stage, and that really carries on all the way through to, in Australia, a typical Series A could be 3.5, whereas in San Francisco could be 8.5 million in terms of funds invested. And of course, there's information here as well on the pre-money valuation here in the fourth column as well. So really getting familiar with the metrics in your market is something that's worthy of consideration. And this is another interesting point about then considering what is your actual market. Where should you be building your company? If you want to get US style valuations and US style metrics, then you probably need to consider being incorporated in the US and talking to US investors. So your location of your business can make a lot of difference, not just in terms of the validation of your product and the opportunity of your company, but also in terms of the types of investors that you bring on board. So the other thing that's really worth talking about on the valuation, and I just want to touch on it again, I mentioned it in the other round, in the other slide, is that you really need to think about the valuation that you ultimately settle on as being something that needs to really be easily justified in the next round. Typically, you're asking these early stage investors to pay it forwards and value something that on more traditional methods you would never be valued if you were kind of doing DCFs or more comparables against public businesses. And so it's really a fine balance about everyone's interests and everyone leaving the negotiation happy. There is a danger, of course, of raising at too high a valuation, which is that at the next round of funding, if you can't substantiate that valuation or you can't live up to the valuation, then you may end up raising a down round, which is raising a following round on a lower valuation than the previous round. That can be quite dilutive to the founders, and generally the investors will ask for provisions within the investment round to not be affected by that dilution through anti-dilutive clauses. So it's really important to try and avoid that, because they hurt the founders pretty hard and can be quite demotivating for the founders. But of course, these down rounds do happen. And as I mentioned, by raising funds at a too low valuation, you can create early excessive dilution for the founders. And if you get to a point by Series A where the founders really don't have much skin in the game, then generally we find that everyone within the business investment stack loses as a result of kind of lack of motivation and drive to take the business forwards or reach its potential.
And we're getting some great questions. Can you just go back? I think a couple of really good, relevant questions. There's one by Mohammed asking, how do entrepreneurs evaluate their startups efficiently? Of course, later on, you're going to talk about how important it is to know your industry metrics correctly. Do you want to talk about this a little bit here, given that it's obviously directly related to the valuation as well as what one can secure?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best way to really do this is, one, really make sure you know your product and your business. So know what it is that you're trying to solve and have great validation around the problem that you're trying to solve and the market that you're playing in and how big that market is and what it would take for you to be successful, and have really clear plans on go-to-market strategy, how you win customers, how you retain customers, etc. I'm talking quite generically, because obviously don't know, it will vary different, on a case-by-case basis, and software companies are different to deep tech companies, which are different to hardware companies. But what I find really in terms of what works early on is having a very thorough understanding of your business and the sector that you play in and who your customers are. And then really around understanding the market sizing. And I think if you are going out to raise early stage money on a $5 million valuation or a $6 million valuation, if you can prove that your market size is multi-billion dollars and your real addressable market size, maybe even your local market or in a reasonable geography that you can launch into is that big, then you'll find that actually the kind of combined evidence or inevitability of a great team, a great product, and a huge market size makes those earlier conversations around valuation and negotiation around rounds a lot easier. So I think really understanding the space that you operate in, but the environment around you makes a lot. It really helps. And then obviously things like understanding the metrics that we've got on this slide really support that. And like I said earlier, it is a bit of an art and a science coming together. I think the one other thing that I would say is it's really useful to find great mentors or great entrepreneurs in your local market to help you navigate that depending on what you're doing, and really leverage off the learnings of others.
And what about the situations, and I know that, in Australia, we have this situation quite a bit, that, the Australian startups end up incorporating in Delaware, for example. So we have another question from Mohammed asking if your startup is incorporated in New York, United States, but the trial market is in the UAE, where the best fundraise focus region should be. Where should he be looking to fundraise from?
Yeah, it could be, look, in reality, depending on the stage, it can be either of them. I'm not super familiar with the UAE environment, and I don't know if you've incorporated in New York because you want to launch the business into the US at some point, or you've done it more for other reasons. But ultimately, if you think that later stage funding is going to come from US investors, then then it's definitely it can make for an easier process to really get your incorporation in the right place from day one, and save the pain and the trouble later on of transferring it over to the US, which I think could be a bit of a challenge, not insurmountable, but a bit of a challenge. I guess the question is, if you're incorporating in the US but your launch market's in UAE, then if you're raising in the US, you're going to have to find those investors who are comfortable investing in businesses that are operating out of market. And I find that a lot of US investors are comfortable investing in businesses that operate out of market, whereas a lot of them will only invest in businesses that operate within the US. At the same time, if you're raising money in the UAE, you've got to find investors that are comfortable investing in a business that's incorporated in the US. So look, there's no real. It's hard to answer without understanding why you've incorporated in the US in the first place. But if it's because you think that ultimately that's going to be the market that you dominate and you get great traction in, but your kind of launch market for really getting product market fit and understanding your product is UAE, then I think you could probably try both markets. One thing that we haven't really mentioned here, but it will become more evident later on, is that fundraising is a very, very heavily engaged process where you build personal relationships with investors. And whilst the early polls said that a lot of investors will make investments over Zoom, I don't know that they envisage necessarily having an entire 10-year relationship with their investee companies over Zoom. So I think wherever you plan to spend most of your time operating, you're likely to find greater success in raising money, especially in the earliest stages.
Okay, now I guess one last one, because I think this is on everyone's mind. Sulaiman gave the question how to deal with greedy VCs, but I think what we're really looking at here is what is the trade-off between actually getting some money right now versus giving up too much, or what you perceive to be too much? What would be your advice?
So I think the reality is that when you're bringing VCs on, if you're bringing VCs in, you really want to be focused on bringing in those VCs that add a lot of value, and that can be everything from a top tier brand name that gets you noticed, that unlocks lots of doors to you, to VCs who are domain experts and can really help accelerate your business. They're going to get a bit more hands-on with you and really help. And I think when you're looking at what you're giving away here, it is a trade-off of how much is the partner that I'm bringing in going to really make a difference and accelerate what we're doing, or de-risk our journey and essentially enable us to get to a place where everyone's really happy with the outcome. So my view is I really look at the credentials of the VC. And, I think naturally the ones with the bigger brand names may well ask for a little bit more equity. But if because you've got a big brand name VC, you can more easily attract funding to your current round and funding on the future rounds, and it makes that journey easier and increases your chances of success, then to some extent that's probably a deal worth taking. If you've got an unknown VC who is super, or a family office or an investor who's super inexperienced, being super greedy, then you have to ask yourself if that's a sensible deal to be making, and actually should you pass on it or consider different structures or negotiate. So again, these things are never really black and white, but I think with VCs where they can really add value, it's again, it's always a bit of a negotiation, but you may find that they ask for a little bit more than you're willing to give, and you should really look at the advantages on the pros and cons of what they give. One thing, and I've mentioned it a couple of times already, to just watch out for though, is around dilution. And what you'll find is those top VCs will be really conscious of not overly diluting the founders, because they understand the impact of creating a cap table that isn't motivated or productive in terms of generating a great outcome. And once the VC is invested in your business, then they're fully aligned with you, and their outcome's only going to be great when you get an exit.
Awesome. Let's move on very quickly to our next poll, and then there's a couple of other questions. I think I promised to respond to Ayush's question. So just very quickly, again, the same poll as previously from NFX. According to the VC Startup Sentiment Survey run by NFX, over half of the respondents expect a decrease of valuation of early stage companies during this time by, and you can see the percentage ranges under the poll. Great. I think we kind of, yeah, no, we're still going. So over 60% of people, around 60% of people have voted for 20 to 30%, and that is what the NFX survey has showed us. So they believe that we will see a decrease of valuation somewhere between 20 to 30%. Just very quickly on financing options, that Ant has spoken about the valuation at length. I think this is a very, very important topic. But even before we get to the valuation, one has to decide how one is going to actually give away equity or otherwise slice up the company. So obviously venture financing usually takes place in rounds. Of course, you know that the naming convention is pre-seed, seed, Series A, and so on. We can go all the way pre-seed, pre-IPO can be all the way up to an F round. It can happen very, very easily. So just a few concepts here to get our heads around. Obviously, the most common one is an equity round. This is where the transaction numbers are fixed, and it's a certain event. We also have, and this has become more and more popular, dominating in the West Coast of the United States, the SAFE instruments, which stands for Simple Agreements for Future Equity. This is where the investor decides how much they're willing to invest, and they fix a cap of the valuation, and more often than not there is also a discount attached to this cap, so it becomes the lower of the cap and the pre-money valuation less the discount that was agreed. This is a variation on the more traditional convertible notes that had been in the market for a little bit longer. And of course, one can't really forget that we can always look for grants and subsidies, and more often than not, governments have these in place, especially governments who are looking at the innovation ecosystem and looking at how to kickstart or how to maintain or how to give a boost to early stage innovation or innovation at large. There are a lot of grants and subsidies that are available. This is particularly important for research and development. So those startups who are more deep tech, who are looking at commercializing an IP, for example. Of course, recently, and you will all know this, crowdfunding has become a popular way of raising some money. The sustainability of crowdfunding a business all the way to a series exit is probably questionable. However, we all know somebody who's put a great product on Kickstarter or Indiegogo. But of course, as it says here, a desirable product is not the same as an investable business. So be careful with the pros and cons of these types of valuations. I want to, or these types of contributions. I wanted to talk about a question that we received a little bit earlier from Ayush, and it seems like it's quite a popular question, where you have asked whether we think going forward the role of those investment bankers, advisors become important, who are able to get more curated deals across to the investors. I come from a banking background, and actually over the last decade or so, I have actually observed quite the opposite. I think what's been happening in the market is that, of course, historically, the deals that were available or that people wanted to get access to, the pre-IPO Uber deals or large chunks of Airbnb, these more later stage deals were only available through large platforms and banks. I think what's currently happening is that these types of deals are more and more available on the secondary market. There is a lot more transparency around what is out there. There is a lot more marketplaces for these types of opportunities. And I think what's also happening is that people are happy to go and take risks earlier and earlier. So I think, ANTLER, for example, our platform, we run multiple funds. And one of the reasons why our investors really like what we do is because we provide highly curated pipeline to our investors at a very, very super early stage. So I think what's currently happening in the market is that, if you have the due diligence capability, if you're a family office, for example, who wants to ultimately invest directly, if you have the capability to do that in-house, that's great. You actually, with a little bit of work, you can really find very high quality startups in the industry that you're specifically interested in. And if you prepare to take the early stage risk, then it is possible to actually find these startups and ride away with those startups. So I think there is a lot more transparency. There is a lot more out there in the market. Having said that, and I think that this is the sort of key message, is that the skill set of actually picking winning startups, picking really high quality curated startups is still a skill set that is not widely out there, although a lot more people are learning about it, given that there is a lot more transparency. And this leads me a little bit more to the types of investors. And once again, it's very important to note that these types of investors are very, very important at different stages of your company's growth. So we spoke about the friends and family round. We talked about how they are super important at the very, very beginning. That you really have very limited traction. You probably don't even have a product. You just have an idea. You just have a solution, but no product at all. Your friends and family come in and they support you. Angels are an extraordinarily important part of the ecosystem. They really are the extension of the friends and family. They come in, they can help you not just with money, but expertise, which is often very, very important to get into a network when you, for example, need a pilot partner for your startup. And as you start to grow, of course, institutional money or smart money becomes more and more important. Of course, this can be in the shape of VC funds, family offices, and of course, recently we've also got a lot of corporates who have organized themselves into corporate VCs. The corporate venturing activity takes place either from the balance sheet itself of the corporate, or some corporates who are more sophisticated or more further down along their journey. They've also incorporated standalone venture capital units. And they are, of course, most of the time strategic investors. They're looking for investments that will enhance their existing business. And then last but not least, we already spoke about crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, of course, has its benefits. It can be a great bridge. You can, use it, especially at the early stages when you are, when you have a prototype of your product, and you want almost like a bridging loan, if you like, to get you to be able to, produce 100 products or 1,000 products. So all of these are available forms of financing yourself. Very quickly, I'm conscious of the time. they wanted to talk to you about these really important 5 steps of the fundraising process: defining the fundraising targets and the timing, mapping the target investors, and of course the materials that you should have, your first face-to-face or Zoom meetings, your pitching, and then your negotiating and signing. Over to you, Ant.
Thanks, guys. I think in the interest of time, because we've only got a few minutes left, I believe the slides are going to be circulated after. And what I'll really do is just skip through these very, very quickly. But the processes that we take them through in terms of fundraising targets is really about, again, a reinforcement of what we said earlier of how much cash do you actually need? Where will that get you to? What's the next milestone? Put the buffer in. And then really goes into also talking about the different types of fundraising methods that you can use, whether it be an equity round or a safe round, and the benefits of those. Again, we talked about a financial plan earlier, and also the need for you to be a real expert in your sector and understand your metrics. And just on the right here, we put down a lot of common metrics, and there's a lot of information out there in terms of the right metrics for your business, whether it be a SaaS business or a hardware business or whatever it is. And I think that's something to really get on top of and understand in terms of the levers and the influence that it has on your business. Any sophisticated investor is going to expect you to want to know about these. We then advise you guys to map out your investors.
Yeah, no, go for it. And I was going to say that I think that planning, one of the things that is a very, very simple advice, but, we see this over and over again, that people don't plan who they're going to actually approach. They don't prioritize. And as a result of that, the strategy itself is not really a strategy. It's more of a sort of shotgun approach. So we would always recommend actually researching the available universe for you, prioritize. And then the most important message I think I can give, and we tell this to our startups over and over again, and this is where, ANTLER helps a lot, is to the extent possible, don't go cold to the VCs. Try and find someone who knows somebody in there who can make a qualified, warm introduction for you. It's better to wait a week for a qualified, warm introduction, a good word, rather than trying to go cold. If it's absolutely necessary to go cold because you are in no situation to be able to reach out to find a connection, then I would say that you've got to spend a lot of time on making that one email super impactful. And there are some advice in here of, how this should look like, what kind of information you should have in there.
And then in terms of going and just really supplement what Andrea said, just really make sure you understand why you're speaking to the investor in advance and why that investor would be interested in you. And the quicker you can kind of bring that to the table and make that obvious, the more likely you are to have a great conversation. The difference between angels and lead investors, or angels and more VC investors, Andrea covered earlier. Angels typically won't lead rounds, but you can club them together to bring a round together. VC investors or good lead investors will generally lend a lot of credibility to your business and be a lot more professional in running a process with you to get that done. Just in terms of then pitching to investors, I mentioned right at the start that it is a bit of a marathon. Be prepared for a lot of rejection, and Andrea was right in saying that it can be a little bit brutal, and you may have to take 19 no's before you get a yes. I think Spotify actually had in their first seed round 19 no's before someone said yes, and how fortunate that person that said yes on the 20th time was. What we say here is don't go after everyone at once. I would leave the most obvious investors. Don't make the most obvious investors or your kind of dream investor the first meeting. Go and meet a few other investors first. Practice your pitch, get the feedback, refine it, etc., and then start to go to those investors that you definitely really want. So start with friendly investors or the ones that you're a little bit less fussed about. Get your pitch really to a great position, and then go and knock it out the park with that dream investor. And make sure you really tailor your pitch deck to each investor based on where they invest and where their interests are, to make sure you really get maximum engagement. Just some really obvious hygiene things here, but quite often where you have a great meeting, you might put an hour in a diary, but where you have a great meeting, the investor will just want to spend more and more time with you. So make sure you put a buffer after your meeting as well, because I think that's incredibly, it's great. It's a great sign to see if an investor goes to 90 minutes with you when you originally only had a 30 or a 60-minute meeting. Make sure you definitely, as a team of co-founders, if you are a team of co-founders, both contribute in the meeting and really try to lift each other in terms of positive energy and vibes through that meeting, and really engaging with the investor, and keep rejigging your pitch deck as you come across better ways of explaining a concept. Keep improving it and keep improving it. Then on negotiate and sign, I think the key things that I really want to kind of pull through that we learn here is that time does kill deals. If you've got someone that's really interested, then you need to keep following up with them and pushing them to the finish line. Don't let too much time go, because if they're an active angel, then they may just become interested in other opportunities, and they may only have a fixed finite amount of money. So once you've got someone super interested, move to close that deal as quickly as you possibly can. Be really honest throughout. Don't mislead. Don't try and play VCs off each other, and definitely don't say if you've got a commitment from another investor if you don't. You'll ultimately destroy credibility with that investor that you're talking to if you're found to not be wholly truthful. And most of you may well operate in small markets where word gets around, and it's certainly not a reputation that you want. And then a few don'ts here, and look, these might seem quite obvious, but I think they're worth just calling out in terms of the ways to engage with investors and VCs. They'll be really used to seeing businesses at your stage, and so I don't think there's any reason to be dishonest or not be completely transparent with where you are in the business and how you're approaching the process. But really don't be dishonest in any way. You're often talking as well to remember that the people you're talking to, they might be VCs, but they're also human. They're and they probably want to have a friendly meeting. And you got to remember that if you do take their investment, you're likely going into a relationship with them if you're going to be successful for 5 to 10 years. So they absolutely want to know that they're investing in people that they're going to enjoy spending time with, etc. So make sure that you are friendly, engaging, and don't be arrogant or unfriendly or aggressive. It's okay to say you don't know things in meetings with investors, and actually if you don't know something, I would encourage you to say I don't know, and I'll follow up, and then follow up with that information rather than guess. I think it's a really off-putting sign where people are trying to guess answers or trying to impress us for the sake of having all the answers, and VCs meeting numerous people day in day out can really start to smell where there's a lie, or people are kind of winging it versus people really know their thing. And it's okay. We don't expect everyone to know everything about everything all the time. Don't talk so much investors can't get a word in. You'll learn a lot about the kind of feedback that they're giving to you and the kind of questions that they're asking you, and be curious about the questions that they're asking you as well. As mentioned, follow up the deal really quickly. Don't break an agreement, verbal or written. So don't enter into agreement if you're not entirely sure about it. Don't use, make sure that your financial plan and your market sizing is really well justified and really well deeply thought through. When meeting investors, I think another good few things to kind of think about is make sure you take control of the meeting. So don't get too caught up in tangents, and often we see people discussing things that are really taking them away from the core of what they're doing, and really recognize that behavior and be able to bring it home and back to base. And then I think the last kind of couple of things is, generally speaking, don't ask a VC for an NDA. They don't have time to read NDAs. They won't get into legal agreements at the start. And if you ask them for an NDA, they'll just stop talking to you. And then don't take no personally. Like I said, you may have to have 20 meetings before you find someone that's interested in what you're doing.
Guys, we are over time, so I'm super conscious. So just very quickly, I just wanted to highlight here, what happened to Zoom, Slack, and House Party over the last 2 months. It's just a great reminder that some of these businesses can benefit from this current dislocation exponentially. We wanted to highlight a few cases within Antler. I won't be doing that. You can just read about that. And then there's been a number of questions around opportunities that we are excited about. Just very quickly, obviously education, is something that we're looking at super closely. It's a very interesting area. I personally think, and I think those of you who have children at home, education has changed forever. I don't think we're going back. I think that we will see a much more hybrid way of delivering content for our children. I think health tech will we'll see a lot of improvement. There will be a lot more technology that is going to be intertwined with caregiving. The future of work is all up for grabs. We will not be working the same way as we have done prior to January 2020. That is absolutely sure. This was a huge experiment, or is a huge experiment globally, and I think people are showing that we can work from home, and that work-life balance can coexist together. And then last but not least, we're excited about esports and gaming. This is a trend that has started, a few years ago, mostly in China. I've been living in Asia for 10 years. This is now e-gaming, esports is coming, is hitting the West. And we're super excited about the possibilities in that field as well. So with this, thank you so much for your time. I know that we are a few minutes over time. I believe we're 5 minutes over time. Thank you so much for the engagement. There's been so many great questions. Sorry if we haven't responded to all. I will try and do that whilst we're sitting here through the panel. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Guys.
Thank you so much, Andrea, Anthony. Thank you. That was such an interesting presentation and very insightful. I'm sure the startups who have joined us today can take back a lot. Just to let everybody know in the audience members that the presentation will be shared right after the webinar gets over. So you'll be receiving an email with the link to download the presentation. So you will have access to the presentation right after the webinar. But the webinar has not ended yet. Anthony, thank you once again for joining us today. Andrea, we shall invite you back on after the moderator's introduction.
Sure.
Now I would like to invite Robin Brazil to introduce her session and invite the panel of experts. Please do not forget to type your questions in the question box so the speakers can address them during the webinar. Robin, over to you to invite your guest up on stage.
Great. So can you hear me, Prashant?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. So we already have an Andrea here. Next, I would also like to invite Basil Mofta, just from a little bit down the road here in the UAE at Global Ventures. If you could please join us on stage. And then next, I would also like to invite Shashank Randev from 100x.vc, joining us from India. Shashank, if you can also make your way to the stage. And last but not least, I would very much like to invite Kenza Lalu from Outliers Ventures. Great. So I think we're just missing Basil Mofta. If you can please join us on the stage as well, then we'll have everyone together. So while we're waiting, so thank you very much, Andrea. If you can come back to the stage. Hey Basil.
Hey Robin, how are you?
Very good. Good to see you. So while we're waiting on Andrea to rejoin us, I just want everyone in the audience. So while I was enjoying Antler's presentation, thank you very much for that. I think towards the end, very, very tangible takeaways for all of the entrepreneurs that we have in the audience. But this is a very, very truly global audience and a truly global panel. So maybe we can dive into some of the questions around what's happening in specific geographies. In particular, I noticed that we have members in the audience all the way from several African nations, Gambia, Zambia, Nigeria, South Africa, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, I saw. Also Bangladesh, UAE, Jordan, India, Mexico, and Chile. So an incredibly diverse group of entrepreneurs and audience members. So I think Andrea's maybe having some trouble joining us unless I can see her here. So she's already introduced herself, which was kind of the next bit. So I would love, maybe we can start with you, Kenza, and then Basil and Shashank. Just briefly introduce yourselves, the focus of your VC, maybe stage, sectors, geography, if relevant, and then we can get started.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Glad to be here. So I'm the managing partner of Outliers Ventures, which is an early stage VC fund that is Africa focused. And we invest in tech-enabled companies that are leveraging technology to transform in the traditional businesses and industries. So we focus on 4 main markets: Morocco, where we are based, Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya. So those are the primary market, but we are open to invest across Africa. And we do mainly seed and pre-series A. Yeah.
So what does that mean in your context? Because I know that's one thing that's very stratified across geography. So what is a typical ticket size when you say kind of pre-seed for your area?
Yeah, so seed and pre-A actually.
Pre-A.
So so those are tickets between 50K up to 250K, first check and then follow on. So we invest in rounds that could start at, I don't know, 500K up to $2-3 million, depending on the stage, the maturity of the company. So we always invest post market and post revenue. So that's the main things. And depending on the nature of the business, the team, we can go. It depends a little bit on where we want to enter the deal.
Great, thank you, Kenza.
Sure.
Basil, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, I wasn't sure who was next. Yeah, of course. So my name is Basil. I'm a general partner with Global Ventures. Global Ventures is a Dubai-based VC fund that focuses on growth stage investments in the Middle East and across Africa as well. It's a $50 million fund, a first-time fund that we closed back in December. So thankfully, we have all of our money now. And I've been deploying over the last year and a half and are continuing to deploy. There's 14 companies in the portfolio at this stage. We're in the process of finishing up 1 or 2 more investments that we had committed ourselves to earlier this quarter, if you like, or earlier in Q1. We invest between 1 and 3 million. So we're looking for revenue generating companies that have already established themselves in at least one market. The premise of Global Ventures is to help companies move across markets and to help them to expand regionally and even in many cases globally around the world. I'm just by way of introduction as well, I'm also a member of the investment committee for Dubai Angel Investors, which is an early stage investor here in Dubai that focuses on sort of pre-revenue idea stage or early product development. And obviously one acts as a feeder into the other, right? Because you build relationships with startups from a very early stage.
Thank you, Basil. Shashank, over to you.
Thanks, Robin. Hi, my name is Shashank Randev. I'm the founder VC at 100x.vc. It's India's first venture fund to invest in early stage startups using iSafe, which is India's simple agreement for future equity notes. We launched the fund in July 2019 and are the first institutional investor in our portfolio companies. We've invested in 20 startups till date. The fund is sector agnostic with a focus on India domiciled startups, invests up to 160K USD per startup. And we're sponsored by Mehta Ventures, which is the family office of Sanjay Mehta. While the number of startups have been on the increase, the access to seed capital, remains a challenge and has been for some time. And we will fill that gap through iSafe notes, backing 100 startups a year and supporting the fast-growing digital India ecosystem.
Great, thank you. And Andrea, welcome back.
Thanks, guys.
So I don't know if you want to just do a very, very quick intro, because it looks like most of the audience has still stayed from your original presentation, but maybe just give a recap about Antler's focus.
Sure. Antler is a global early stage VC. We invest at the earliest stage at the lowest possible valuation, what we call pre-seed, institutionalizing really the very early end of investments. We are industry agnostic, tech enabled, and I head up our capital function globally. We are in 11 locations from Sydney all the way to LA, and everywhere in between. We are actually in Nairobi in Africa, 4 locations in Europe. Yeah, thank you very much for such a great audience, really great participation.
Great. So I guess we'll dive right into it. So I think so many of you have been on panels recently. We've seen a lot of coverage about recommendations from VCs. We just saw the wonderful Antler presentation. So I feel like one thing that entrepreneurs often lose sight of, VCs as their own business and business model, and you guys having to also report into your LPs. In addition to all 4 of you, these are pretty new funds, very new funds. So what are the conversations like with your LPs happening right now, and how much is that guiding some of the decisions that you're making about your investments and helping your portfolios? So anybody? So
sure, I'm happy to jump in. Let's get started.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, I think first of all, I hope everybody's safe, and I wish everybody the best during the crisis. It's not a simple time, and there's a lot of moving parts, and I know everybody's been working incredibly hard to keep themselves healthy and their businesses healthy and so on. The crisis really, in my mind, comes in 3 phases. One phase is that sort of immediate shock. The shock being travel's shut down, work is shut down, or people are working from home, or all the things that are very tangible that we can see around us, and the effects that has on the business. The second part is really about recalibrating, right? In terms of, what am I going to do now? How much cash do I have in the bank? How much, is my business still alive or not? Can I collect my money or not? Can I still deliver my services and so on? And then the third phase is really the long-term effect. Is my industry going to be the same? Is it going to be impacted in the long term? Is this still attractive industry to be in? And so on. I think and what we've been talking with our LPs about is we've just completed the first phase, which is the shock. Things are coming down now. People are now in the recalibration phase. Some businesses have a lot of recalibration to do. Some actually have great upside and benefits, and even those need capital and need investment as well. But in all circumstances, this recalibration is going to last another few weeks. The long term, I don't think we're going to understand that fully in terms of the long term until after the summer. I think it's going to take that long, for us to see the shakeout, and as economies restart, to really see what's functioning and what's not. That's what we're discussing with our LPs.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, go ahead.
At 100x, we've been backed by one LP, which is the family office. So it's essentially money off the balance sheet. But obviously, we are answerable to the LPs and in terms of the returns we give out. So I think in terms of the stage we are at, which is a fund, and as the first check, we rolled out a survey recently, 3 weeks ago, 100x.vc India Sentiment Outlook Survey, and we try to capture these sentiments of the growth stage VC funds in India. And obviously, it's taken a hit in terms of the capital deployment. But our interactions with our LP remains healthy. We have capital to be deployed for the remaining 80 startups. For our existing 20 investments, we've been working very, very closely with them in terms of cash preservation. 12 have gone ahead and raised rounds from global HNIs and VCs and family offices. But yes, as Basil said, nobody has the right answers in terms of how this will pan out. I think everybody's trying to work very closely with their portfolio companies to ensure cash preservation and profitability. And hence, as a function of that, we are we are likely to have happy conversations with our LPs. So I think everybody's focused on that, at least at 100x.vc.
Great, thanks.
So maybe a few more insights. I think we all agree that no one's know really what's gonna happen, and LPs are investors as well. We are investors in us. We're investors in companies. So for sure, everyone want to be careful, but also sees opportunity in what's happening. So it's a balance, I think. And for now, the idea is to really understand what's happening and also try to see where the next opportunities would be. And of course, focus on the existing portfolio to make sure we can help those who need it. But we are lucky to have companies that are in sectors that are being actually positively impacted by what's happening. So I think I would say it depends, but overall, our LPs are high net worth and family offices that already believe in the digitalization of the economy. So I think this is a time where digitizing the economy has never been more important.
Thank you, Kenza. Andrea, do you have anything else to add? What are your discussions with your LPs like now?
I think everything that that people said before me. I think just in addition, obviously we all four of us here are GPs in earlier stage funds, and as you pointed out, these are young funds. I think the reality of it is that our investors have given their money to us for over the next 10 years, which is a long period of time. So I think in summary, we have relatively patient capital. Having said that, we're doing everything that everyone else is talking about. Of course, we're talking to our portfolio companies. We're making sure that there's cash preservation. We're prioritizing actions. We're helping the ones that need us most. But the venture capital industry, if you look back, those startups that were, a lot of the startups that were started after the global financial crisis have done pretty well. So let's see what happens.
Okay, thank you. So while we kind of gear up for the next question for the panel, I'd also like to add a poll. I found that really useful when Andrea was discussing. So we know that we have a majority of early stage founders. I'd like to know a little bit more about what you guys are facing. So one of my poll questions is, so you're early stage, but what does that mean? There's a question coming on right now. You are about to launch, recently launched in the last 6 months, or you are 1 to 2 years out or 2+. So we know kind of set what that means. And then also some situations that you've recently been facing. Since we know the VC perspective, I'd like to hear the entrepreneur perspective. If any of you, the second poll is going to be if you have recently had an interest of investment that has been taken away in the past few months in the COVID context. So I want to know if that's happening to you now, and we can unpack that. And then the last poll question, while we discuss, I'll come back to the poll results, is when we talk about cash preservation, let's be real in what that means and oftentimes how that impacts your team. So I'd like to know from the entrepreneurs if decisions have been made to reduce or furlough employees. So then we can kind of talk, knowing a little bit more about how this is specifically impacting the group. So if we can, we'll get those polls started. Go ahead and answer if you will, and I'll come back so that we all know what we're looking at. Okay, so the next area I'd like to discuss with our panelists is, I think there was a lot of discussion before. I think one thing that about the 68% of VCs that would make a decision over a Zoom call. So we have 4 VCs sitting here. Are you guys in that 68% that you would seriously consider making an investment decision, having never met the founder in person, let's set that criteria, entirely over a sequence of your series of video conferencing calls?
So I'm going to start here just very, very quickly because Antler's business model really lends itself very well to answer this question very precisely. We actually run programs. So in a single location, we run 2 programs every single year. And in the old world, aka 2019, what would have happened is that we recruited 100 founders. In Singapore, just to give you an example, we receive about 3,000 applications for 100 spots. So it's about 3% of people who apply get into the program. And so if I think back to what used to happen is you would have these founders all coming together. Day one would be the most exciting situation in the office. There would be 100 extraordinarily talented people in the same room. You can imagine the energy. Now, fast forward to 2020, we are now running our programs wholly digitally. So a lot of these people will have never met. Most of them will have not met. And we were able to, we have our own development and our own proprietary systems and tech. So we're able to pivot very, very easily to upgrade our, what we call a Founders Hub, which is our own platform to make sure that these people get to know each other. And throughout this very important path of 2 months, they get to see each other, get to interact with each other, to mimic as much as possible the real environment, and to be able to find their perfect co-founder. And we only make an investment after the 2 months. So if you take that 100 people, only about 40% of those people end up getting an investment. For the first time in the history of Antler, we run 5 investment committees throughout the month of April that were entirely online, and we made over 40 investments. So I just wanted to say to you that we kind of walk the talk. These people have met and come up with the business ideas all virtually, and the programs were run, most of them are run virtually because obviously they will have started in January, and we made over 40 investments in the last 6 weeks.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Yeah, Kenza, does that ring true to you?
Yeah.
An outline? Yeah.
So as we are an early stage VC fund, and we invest in rounds. We co-invest in rounds, especially outside of our local market. So the short answer is yes. We do put the whole process digitally, especially now. But we've done that before as well. Since we invest, as I said, in 4 main markets that are far away from each other. Most of the time we would have met the founder before. But sometimes it happened that even before now in the old world, as you said, it happened that we would run the whole process digitally, and we would do it via Zoom links, and even our IC we were used to do it on the conf calls. So for us, it's not a big change. It's just smoothing up everything because we don't need to to move as much, and we can even be more focused and go faster. But we have a very straightforward and intense process that we run, and it's only getting better. So for us, it was not a big change, but I think for other investors it might.
Yeah, all and really encouraging. Basil, how about you guys at?
Yeah, we just completed our first Zoom deal, as they call them. So sure, the answer is yes. It's ironic, but I actually think for later stage it would be easier. And let me explain why. Because the company exists, you can actually call clients and do reference checks with them. There's more validation points that you can collect. I think with early stage, and again, I give it to the experts on the call here who do early stage. There is an element of chemistry of the individual, which is important, I think, in the sort of the idea of which entrepreneur to back up. Now, don't get me wrong. I do think you have to build a rapport, even if it is through Zoom. So, there's probably there were more calls on this deal than if we had done things face to face, right? There were more interactions. And we'd even go over the same questions or the same materials twice, just to be able to make sure that we're hearing it correctly and we're getting the same sentiment from the entrepreneur that maybe in a face-to-face meeting we would have taken a bit more for granted because body language and things like that are easier to see in a face-to-face conversation. Do I think we'll do more deals this way? Yes, but I do think, where the source is, who's presenting us the deal, how's it coming to us, becomes an important element of being able to do a Zoom deal, as I think they're called.
Yeah, nice. Shashank, what about you guys?
Yeah, I think, like my fellow panelists, I think the situation is the same. Last year, 2019, we did all of our deals. The whole objective was to close deals very quickly in 20 to 25 days. And most of them were interactions with founders who were outside the city, Mumbai. And at the closure, we required them to come to our office physically and meet. But most of the due diligence, the tech due diligence was done mostly virtual. And I think that continues right now. We've issued a few term sheets in the last 3.5 weeks. The last leg of closure in terms of meeting those founders physically might not happen now for a couple of weeks. And hence we will continue to have, as Basil mentioned and other panelists mentioned, possibly lead to closures with an extra number of meetings which will happen virtually. But yes, deals will happen, and we are in the process of closing. I think digital will happen. It's a very interesting point which Basil brought out. I didn't think of it from that perspective, but when he mentions it's correct. I think later stage deals have a better chance of getting closed online, because the sense of validation, calling up the customers and doing a due diligence becomes a lot more efficient. Agreed. Even at the early stage, I think ours is more largely driven on two aspects: IP and founders. While IP can be done online, founders is something I think is a function of at least a meeting. And I think that might convert into not one meeting but multiple meetings online. So that's my take.
Okay. But this is when Basil was saying that actually how the introduction is coming and who is endorsing these people, it's very important. And I think it goes back to what we talked about half an hour ago, that if I was fundraising now and if I was an entrepreneur, I'd much rather wait for a very warm introduction to the to the correct, from the correct person to the correct person. And unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So I think networking becomes even more important, right? Just finding that connection so that there is that warm endorsement, that qualified endorsement from somebody.
Yeah.
So networking is something that obviously we all kind of have to come to terms with, whether it means we are deep diving in our second and third connections on LinkedIn and sending messages. What does that look like? Any tips, tricks, ways, or even platforms or mechanisms? Because I know networking is a crucial part for startups to get to know you guys. And I know you guys, you have your multiple kind of barriers in place, but it's often a very good touch point that, oh, I met you at, ArabNet, Egypt, or I saw you at a demo day of this accelerator. Are you guys still kind of attending whatever you can virtually? Is it the same? And then how can startups get those direct intros to you guys?
I'm glad I don't have to do events anymore. I have to tell you that. Yeah. I mean, it was time consuming, and definitely, yes, there's value in going to events, don't get me wrong. But that for the time and reward, I always wondered how valuable it was, and now I guess I know, which is you can do a lot from your, working from home or working from your office or whatever, without having to walk around aimlessly at these events hoping to bump into a few randomly good entrepreneurs. Yeah. That being said, yes, it is harder to network in this environment, right? There's no doubt, because your immediate circle, your close circle, those are the ones you're in touch with. To reach out and get beyond those circles becomes all that little bit tougher. And we talked about it, the value of introduction. I also would say the value of updates and well-written updates has become, increasingly important. My guess is I'm getting about 120 to 150 emails a day at this point, of which a good chunk of them are just people updating. And I really appreciate the entrepreneurs who can put that message in a short format, who can give me the highlights of what's been going on, who don't make it sound like they're sending it to everybody, even though they might be, but are sending it, to me. Hey, Basil, remember last time we spoke about, my traction? I closed that great contract I was telling you that was coming in. Besides here, I've hired these 3 people. Those updates are helpful in then getting me to prioritize what I want to focus on next, right? Because then I can say, well, yeah, that was an entrepreneur, that's somebody that I want to follow up with. That update was useful in sort of triggering me to follow up on the next stage of discussions. We say no more than we say yes, right? We say no 99% of the time. No doesn't mean you don't stay in touch. No just means this is not the right deal right now. It could become relevant down the line, and I like people who know how to keep that communication going.
Great. Thank you. So I think we have some of the poll responses. So of the early stage founders that we have, it looks like a third of them have had a serious offer of investment rescinded. And then as far as how they have restructured their businesses and measures they've taken, it looks like 40% have sent their employees on unpaid leave or laid off employees, and another quarter are also considering it in the next 3 months. So I think this is indicative of what I'm also seeing kind of on average, kind of being an early stage accelerator and looking at our alumni companies. So I think let's talk about what these startups can do. Certainly some of them have already taken those drastic measures, but when we talk about kind of making sure that they are reworking their business models, what are some other tangible things they can be looking at, adjusting their metrics, their time scales, looking towards sustainability versus high growth? What are some things that you guys are counseling your portfolio companies on where they can find that extra runway? Yeah.
I go and I just put an obvious one out there, which is cost of an office. If you can get out of your contract, if you can negotiate, one of the largest costs that you will have other than human resources is going to be your office costs. And I think that there are effectively sort of binary situations here where if you can work from home, from your garage, if you can afford to do that and you can give up the office space, then it's well worth doing. Otherwise, you can always negotiate. In Singapore, and once again, we're all in different places, and it's actually wonderful. And I would love to hear how this is going down everywhere. But in Singapore, the government has made a huge amount of effort supporting actually SMEs, and that would be startups as well, with sort of covering rents and how long it lasts, who knows. But as a general kind of item, I would say rent. And then in addition to that, absolutely 100% research whatever government support is available to you and to your staff, religiously all the time, because you might find that you have not taken advantage of something that's available to you. So we are operating in 11 different jurisdictions. We are basically systematically talking to our partners day in, day out to make sure that they have discovered all the available government support there is out there, and they're communicating that to the founders.
Thanks. Shashank, what is the situation in India for startups and SMEs? Are there these support mechanisms in place? How easy are they to access, and are they actually being deployed?
Yeah, in India, I think the same situation, and that's a very interesting perspective Anja shared. I think for early stage investors, the only strict advice to the portfolio companies is office space. If you can reduce that, the cost associated with that is a huge benefit. If you can take care of that. In terms of government providing provisions, various schemes coming around for startups, those are all in place. And while there is a process and methodology in terms of acquiring those or applying for them, the focus still remains on for our portfolio companies is how do you continue to get recurring customers. And while some of the businesses, direct consumer-facing businesses have taken a hit, we've invested in, a couple of them, and it's purely not a function of COVID, but a function of lockdown, which has affected their progress. on a week-to-week basis. But some of the other companies have done phenomenally well. They've kind of taken leverage of this situation and also in terms of done a pivot. So for instance, we had a education startup which is doing very, very well. We had an offline dialysis center startup, which irrespective of lockdown or COVID or any other calamity, continues to generate business. We're just concerned, is he taking care of himself in terms of his personal health? So various aspects. One is cost. The other is, the health of the founders in terms of even if they're doing well business, doing their business well, they're still required to go out. Are they taking care of themselves? For instance, we've invested in a chocolate brand called Decadence. While you'll assume that they might not end up doing so well in such time, they managed to get inside certain chain of retail stores. And we're trying to figure out how you then ensuring the touch points in terms of, ensuring the bottles are sanitized, so on and so forth. So all aspects, all our energies are going into just mapping this out. And also we are a seed capital, so our fund will most likely last them 6 months. And we're hoping that, as a function of they continuously generating business will lead them to raise future rounds or bridge rounds. And that is happening. So that's been promising. But yes, some of the companies have been affected, and it's purely not, it's a function of being in a lockdown situation, not being able to interact with customers. The quarterly targets have taken a back seat purely because the decision making at the client side has taken slightly longer time. And this is particularly applicable for SaaS businesses. But then again, I'm still optimistic. I think there's huge opportunity for founders to kind of work around this crisis. We all of us would be working from home for the foreseeable future. A lot of large companies have taken in India particularly, larger organizations like TCS have announced that all their employees are going to be working out of home for the next 2 years. That's a huge opportunity for SaaS entrepreneurs to build out low bandwidth softwares to manage these employees. So excited, scary, but it's good to be rolling up your sleeves and just working. We don't know how it's going to pan out, but we still need to work towards it.
Yeah. Thanks, Shashank.
Well, just a few words maybe to add on this. So for sure, start with the cutting costs, starting with the non-strategic ones, marketing, any subscription, contractors, anything that you can. And then, as has been mentioned, rent is a big one. So if you cannot go out of the contract, maybe renegotiate with the landlord to pay later, something like that, because they want you to stay as long as possible. So for them, having missing 3 months but being paid later is better than not being paid at all for a long time. And then maybe thinking of finding new ways of revenue. So really adapting the product to try to find new revenue streams, even if it means to tweak it or to change it to meet the needs of this current situation. And then we don't know how things would be, but it's really being on a constant adaptation. And then, of course, finally, employees, which is the hardest part. So maybe for those who don't have any choice, maybe think of upsides for the future, always, to see who are the team members that are the most resilient, who believe in the company and are willing to take a salary cut and then get incentivized later. So it's a great way to see and then to really put everyone aligned on the same mission.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I want to take a question from the audience. Ayush had a question about 20 minutes ago asking if the current scenario opens doors for more cross-border and global investment focus for VCs, or whether there is some, the counterpoint, obviously, and we're seeing some governments and countries is the entrenchment, looking inwards. How can we support local economies, local sectors, local businesses? So what is your perspective as panelists from the VC perspective?
I was just starting to answer that. I was typing in an answer, so I'll read it out.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know if that changes, if what's happening now changes a VC's outlook on cross-border. So my point is, if you were looking at cross-border before, then you're continuing to look at cross-border now. And if you weren't, then it's unlikely that this situation makes it easier for you to look cross-border. Because remember, Cross-border deals means, again, you're building relationships with people in another market. It means you're having to foster those relationships. And that's, again, challenged by the current scenario for all the reasons we discussed earlier. So I guess my initial instinct is to say, no, I don't think so. Again, maybe without fully understanding if the question has a certain slight on it. The one thing I will say, though, is VCs have, at least in the Middle East and across North Africa and parts of Africa, we've been talking to each other a lot more than we did in the past, right? Mm-hmm. You know, before it was such a hustle, and it was such a, you know, everybody was so busy out going to all these events, meeting people, taking meetings, etc. Now that we don't have to commute so much and you've got all of that time back at your desk in this lovely office here at home, a lot of it has been spent calling VCs, especially VCs on the same deal. So where we've shared deals or where deals we've done together. And those conversations go from what used to be 5 and 10 minutes in the past to now like an hour long. Hey, what's happening with you? What's happening with your portfolio? What other ideas? Have you been able to raise some more equity or some debt or some financing? What about the offices? Have you cut the offices yet? Let's, you know, don't pay the office bill. Let's make sure none of them pay the office bill. I mean, all sorts of discussions that in the past wouldn't really happen. And I think in that sense, VCs are coming together, less competitive. I mean, you still compete on new deals, I guess, but more, you know, more harmonious in trying to help the portfolios be successful.
Thanks, Basil. So I guess that's a good question about co-investment. And is that also a trend that the rest of you are seeing, that there's an increase in appetite and actual action on co-investment? Or do you see there's other procedural or structural barriers to getting the deals done because of the distance?
I'll go at this. So you know, we don't do co-investments because we want to be the first check into a company and then work with the founders for some time before we take it to the larger growth ecosystem. And the second question is, I agree with Basil. I don't see that cross-border investments increasing because there are funds which have already raised money from their LPs on a specific geography. And if they now focus on a particular different geography, this would require them to raise another fund, which I don't think is advisable right now. So from a function of that, I don't see that happening for at least a year and a half. There are funds who are cross-border and they might continue to do investments. But again, as a pure function of having physical interactions and, you know, building that relationship, as Basil pointed out, will be challenging. So I don't see that happening. Would I want cross-border investments to happen in our portfolio companies? Yes. Mm-hmm. Would we want international investors to be investing? Yes. In fact, we are keeping a global VC pitch day at the end of this week, where some of the HNIs who've invested in our portfolio companies have come from the US. But these are HNIs. These are not VC firms which we've seen investing in companies. And these are all HNIs upwards of 100K or 200K, right? Mm-hmm. So that piece, I think, is more powerful right now in terms of cross-border transactions. Whereas, you know, US citizens investing in India, HNIs investing in India, or the other way around. But VCs, I don't see that immediately.
Well, I think it's very interesting, this conversation, because we see the fundamentally different investment theses depending on the market. Mm-hmm. So for you, Shakshan, your market is so big, it's almost the size of the whole African continent. So you can focus on only India. For us, for example, we don't have any choice. If we want to build a real VC that invests in the best companies, we have to go where the companies are. So we have to invest in those markets that are the most exciting or dynamic in Africa, and where the population makes sense to have a local market. So we, by definition, have a cross-border thesis, starting with with the focus on 4 markets, because otherwise it's too much. But still, and we love co-investing because we need to have local partners locally that can also provide a different kind of added value to the company. And we bring in something different that none of the others would provide, which is access to Francophone Africa. Because we are in Morocco, we have strong relationships with all the Francophone countries, and we have companies, like large companies that are Pan-African and especially for Francophone. So this is a very interesting seeing how the dynamics are different the way you have to structure your investment thesis. So yeah.
Okay, so I think Andrea kind of answered it at the end of her discussion about some sectors that she's really particularly interested in. I don't want to dive into the obvious ones. Education and healthcare have been discussed ad nauseum. I want to talk about some of the other ones that maybe there's a lag now, but let's say in the next 12 to 24 months, you know, is it AR and VR are finally going to find their place somewhere? Is it in agri-tech, local manufacturing, and could there be geographic specific? So I'd love to hear from all of you a few sectors that you guys have your eyes on for the next year or two.
AR, VR is never going to happen. Just drop it. I don't know why people keep talking about it. Guys, keep playing some games. Let's just drop it. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. Every time somebody brings up AR, VR, I can't help myself. Agri-tech, surely very exciting, right? Let's be serious. Global supply chains are vulnerable. I think people will prioritize. I think this has been said already, by a number of people. People will prioritize reliability over cost efficiency. I think that dynamic is going to change. Food supply chains are incredibly important and showed how vulnerable we are as a world in this environment. The future of work is interesting. That's the one that a lot of thinking goes into it, and maybe a little bit of AR, VR if you want to get to the extremes of it. But my parents' generation would have had a job for life. We are a generation that have had maybe 2, 3, 4 jobs per in a lifetime or in a career, if you like. There is a world that in the future maybe that has people having multiple jobs at the same time, frankly. And how that impact, because of this remoteness, whether you're a freelancer or whether you take on part-time work or whether you work for several companies, like as a consultant, or you have a job in the morning and a job in the afternoon, those are things that we're starting to imagine and starting to see as possible outcomes. So the future of work is this is one aspect of it. There's many other aspects of it, but definitely exciting to think about. So yeah, food definitely. E-commerce definitely, and I think the future of work definitely very exciting areas to consider.
Thanks, Basil. What about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about the future of work. I think food within edibles, things that point towards sustainable, more sustainable agricultural practices. I think that's very exciting. But I think just talking about the previous conversation about globality, and I really liked Kenza's point, which is that it really depends where you are. The white spots are so different wherever we are, right? So if you want to know what people are innovating in Sydney, it's not going to be the same as what they're thinking about in Nairobi, and it's certainly not going to be the same as what people are thinking about in New York. So I don't think that there is a sort of one killer idea out there. I think it really depends on where you are. But I think for us, at least at ANTLER, we believe in technology, and we believe in using technology for the benefit of everyone. So for us, we are looking at tech-enabled businesses that work in that particular jurisdiction or in that particular industry that they are set up to serve.
Well, for Africa, there are many opportunities to digitize the very traditional economies and sector. And we've seen that in the past, and we've invested in great companies doing food supply chain already before, and now they're growing faster than before. They were already really on the fast track, but now I think this crisis has shown the importance of having this. So one's in Egypt and one's in Kenya, and both of them actually are doing it differently for their market, but solving the same problem. We also love health tech, and I think now is the time for health tech, because we've seen that we need to have access to health services even if we're on lockdown and at home, and that public hospitals in Africa are really a nightmare. and that they need to be upgraded. So technology is building the missing infrastructure to do that. So health tech, and then also logistics as well, because if you want to get something delivered to you, you need to have this last mile to be done and done effectively. And we've always been interested in this, but it shows again that the importance of it. And I'll say finally, fintech. I think fintech is really important and fundamental. And we need the infrastructure, the infrastructure layer that will enable everything to be built on top of it. And it's happening. So it's very, very exciting to see that in Africa and differently in different geographies, but solving the same problems of, KYC check or having access to banking account and then APIs to make the call and all the infrastructure that is needed.
Yeah. What is fascinating, sorry, just very quickly, what is fascinating about what you're discussing right now is that, a couple of weeks ago, I was coaching one of the teams that in Nairobi, we have a location there. And, the solution that they're looking at is for, if you live in Singapore or UK or India, probably, it's existed for a very long time, right? But for whatever reason, it's not in Africa. And so there's so much space, there's so much to be done, there's so much opportunity there to even just take a solution that exists and just plug it in there. But of course the world doesn't work that way. So I am very fascinated by the opportunity set that the different geographical locations are providing us with.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think just piggybacking on that and then taking from what Kenza said to Shashank, I think fintech is certainly an area that's for similar reasons for unbanked, underbanked, and micro businesses. It has tremendous potential as well.
Yes. In fact, so at 100x, I think for the next set of investments over the next 3 months, we are looking at, deep tech, AI for technology-enabled startups, subscription commerce, your typical SaaS and cloud infrastructure startups, fintech, yes, except lending though. Particularly excited about the whole blue-collar workforce and providing solutions in that space. So we've actually backed 2 companies in that space last cohort of the first set of 20 investments. Particularly excited about EdTech in India, AgriTech, and yes, last mile delivery and logistics. So these are the primary hot sectors for us, particularly for the next 3 months.
Great. So guys, I want to be cognizant of time. We just have a few more minutes. So there is another question from the audience that I think several members joined on. So for startups that are severely affected, they're not going to survive in the market. What would you advise them to do?
Well, it's a complicated question that can't be answered in general, but I think you have to sort of start to think about doing right by your employees, doing right by your shareholders, and doing right by your customers. If you think across each one of those, you come to a slightly different conclusion, and then it comes down to how you as a founder perceive those 3. With your customers, you don't want to leave them hanging dry, so you want to think about how they transition to other services or so on. And if that means selling your IP or your technology or talking to one of your competitors, that may be a solution, and people will remember that. For your employees, same thing. Do what's right by them in terms of, if you're going to have to let them go or eventually wind down the business, then make sure you have enough capital and money to pay, whatever those end of service costs may be. Try to give employees that head notice rather than wake up one morning and say we're shut down and money's run out and so on. So again, do what's right by your employees. And then do what's right by your shareholders, which is if there's a salvage value to your business, then maybe, again, selling the business to a competitor or to another player or who's in the space or who wanted to get into your space, maybe what's right by your shareholders. These are not simple decisions. They're definitely trade-offs to be made. It comes down to your belief. I think the best founders are the ones who go through. I've seen really great founders who've been through terrible experiences shutting down a business, but it's made them all the better for it if they've done the right steps and if they've really been, transparent and honest and open about it.
Thanks, Basil. I think you said it pretty nicely. Andrea, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, after all of that, I think I totally agree with Basil. I think the reality of it is that there are some great founders out there who've got some war stories to tell. And we would love to welcome any of those people at the ANTLER program. We're always looking for people who've been through it. There is tremendous amount to be taught to the people who join us from Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, who've never lived through it. Everyone's learning from each other, and that complementary skill set is super important. And so, more than half of our founders within our programs are repeat founders. And if they failed for the right reasons, then it's a super a valuable experience.
Yeah, and I think to try to, in an effort to end things on a positive note and look at the silver lining, I think for startups and entrepreneurs, they're going to be the beneficiaries of a wealth of talent that unfortunately is going to be coming down from the private sector. And this is my shameless plug. I'm at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and we have some phenomenal students that are looking, the class of 2020, looking off a cliff where they used to go in droves to, the consulting firms. So I think, at least from my perspective, and I'd love to close with your perspective, I think it is a great time to consider starting a business. If you have the capital to invest to get through this this period of time, I think it's a very intriguing time to consider starting your company. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts to share.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, Shasha.
No, please.
I agree. No, I agree. I was just going to give you a little bit more statistics because I remember reading this back in 2017, better years. But what's really interesting is if you ask the graduating Harvard cohort at the time in 2017, MBA cohorts, somewhere between 60 to 70% of them said that they will be entrepreneurs at one point. But if you ask them, when, only 4% of them said like straight after school. So there is definitely, not saying everyone needs to become entrepreneurs, but I think that there's definitely a trend of people doing their own thing. And I think that with coronavirus, and this might be the positive of it, there will be people who will just decide, the life I have led up until now is not the life I want to live. And so there is always space for people who want to do their own thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think being an entrepreneur is hard. It's not a decision that is taken like as if you want to start something just new. And I think taking this decision at this time really shows that you really want it, because it's a hard time. But it's also a time where things can become opportunities. And I think even for those who are entrepreneurs right now and are going through difficult times, first, you're not alone. Everyone is in the same situation. This is to remember. And also, you cannot control everything. Sometimes things happen and you have to do with it. So I would say that maybe it's an opportunity to ask yourself the right questions and the tough question to say, do I really want to go through it? And do I really want to continue? Or is it a time where you have to be honest with yourself, and just if you think you're not willing to fight and it's not the right business to be in, be honest to yourself. And as Basil said, there are plenty of ways to end it in the nice way for everyone. And if not, if you really feel that you can go, you can do it, and you really still want to do it because it's first about what do you feel inside. Then yes, there are other ways to try to find solutions. And first you can look at all the loan capacities available, because there are some loan capacities for entrepreneurs being unlocked right now during this crisis. And talk to your investors; they might have solutions. And also think of doing bridge rounds with your existing investor, much better than raising a new round, because it's a very difficult time. So there are many ways, but I think the one thing is to be honest with yourself.
Great, thanks. So Basil, do you have anything else to close it out?
I'll just say one last thing. You don't have to be a founder. Being an entrepreneur, you can join. There's some great startups that are growing fantastic, and even with the current circumstances, you can join those, learn from them, get the experience that will set you up to be a founder in the near future, right? So this is not just you have to have that spark right this second. There are many ways to be an entrepreneur in the current environment.
Thank you, Shashank. We left you, but we were just kind of wrapping up kind of thoughts on if you had previously been considering taking the leap into entrepreneurship or joining a startup at this particular time.
No, I think my 2 cents is this is a good time to explore opportunities. Business point is right. If you're experienced, you can add value to a growing startup, do that. There's nothing better than working for a startup. If you really feel you're confident enough to build something on and sell it, for me, if you build something on and you can sell it, you're good to go. So a lot of founders end up falling in love with the product but don't end up selling it. So if you've got those basics right, venture into entrepreneurship. This crisis can possibly give out newer opportunities, and it's worth giving it a shot now than just not taking this time out to kind of explore opportunities. So that's my 2 cents, but definitely a good time to look at it.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll wrap up here because we're a bit over time. I want to thank all of the panelists and particularly Andrea. I really enjoyed your presentation ahead of time, but thanks for joining us from all over the world, the audience for having some really great spot on questions. Wishing everybody, safe returns to whatever the new normal is, hopefully in the coming weeks and months. Please stay safe and stay connected. It was great to hear from all of you, and thanks to the AIM organizers. So I'll wrap that up. So have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen to be, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you to all of our speakers for their time and for sharing such an interesting and well-rounded insight. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us. The link to today's presentation and webinar video will be sent to you via email. To register for our upcoming and next webinar, you can go to our website, www.aimcongress.com/webinar. Also follow us on our social media channels to keep yourself updated. Thank you all once again. We look forward to seeing you on the 7th. Thank you.